so cold," the small girl whispered through blue lips, her thin fingers trembling against the massive oak door. Inside, the wealthy landowner gazed down at her with cold eyes that matched the winter storm. "Not my problem," he muttered, closing the door as snow continued to fall. He didn't see his prized stallion watching from the stable, didn't notice as the magnificent animal's ears pricked forward with interest. That night, as the temperature plummeted below freezing, the stable door mysteriously swung open. By morning, the entire village was talking about the miracle at the edge of the forest. A girl who should have frozen to death, found alive and warm beside a horse that had broken free to save her. The rich man's reputation was crumbling, but something far more powerful was being built in its place. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Winter in the small village of Maplewood was unlike anything 12-year-old Lily had ever experienced. The orphanage in the city had been cold, yes, with its drafty windows and perpetually damp corners, but nothing like this bone-chilling, breath-stealing cold that seemed to freeze the very air itself. Snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, transforming the countryside into a blinding white wasteland that made travel nearly impossible. Lily pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her thin frame, the frayed sleeves too short to cover her wrists. She'd been walking for hours, her shoes soaked through, her toes numb beyond feeling. The orphanage had closed suddenly, funding cuts, they'd said, and the children had been scattered to different institutions across the region. But the carriage meant to take Lily to her new home had never arrived at the meeting point. After waiting alone at the crossroads for nearly half a day, Lily had made the desperate decision to follow the road herself. That had been yesterday. Now, as darkness threatened and the temperature continued to drop, she knew she wouldn't survive another night in the open. Ahead, through the swirling snow, lights glowed warmly from the windows of a grand house set back from the road. Elegant and imposing, it stood 3 stories tall with ornate stonework and a slate roof from which icicles hung like crystal daggers. Even half frozen, Lily could tell this was the home of someone important, someone wealthy. Hope fluttered in her chest like a fragile bird. Surely someone living in such splendor would have a small corner where she could warm herself, perhaps even a bit of food to spare. The thought of warmth gave her the strength to trudge through the knee-deep snow, up the long drive. Behind the main house, she could make out the shadowy outlines of other buildings, a carriage house, servants' quarters perhaps, and what appeared to be a large stable. As she approached the front entrance, her gaze was drawn to a movement in one of the stable windows, the silhouette of a horse, its noble head raised as if watching her approach. Lily reached the massive front door, its polished wood gleaming even in the dim twilight. With trembling fingers, she lifted the heavy brass knocker and let it fall once, twice, 3 times. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness of the snowy evening. For a long moment, nothing happened. Lily was about to knock again when she heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door swung open, spilling golden lamplight onto the snow-covered steps. The man who stood in the doorway was tall and imposing, dressed in a fine velvet smoking jacket. His face was handsome in a sharp, severe way, with deep-set eyes and a mouth that seemed more accustomed to frowning than smiling. He looked to be in his late 30s, with threads of silver beginning to appear at his temples. "What business have you here?" he demanded, his voice as cold as the air around them. "Please, sir," Lily said, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "I'm lost, and it's so cold. I was supposed to go to the Millfield orphanage, but my transport never came, and I've been walking since yesterday." The man's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, the worn coat, the cheap shoes now ruined by snow and ice, the red, chapped hands. "Millfield is 20 miles north of here," he said flatly. "You've gone in the wrong direction." "I didn't know," Lily whispered, desperation making her voice break. "Please, could I just warm myself by your fire for a little while? I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." The man's expression hardened, and he glanced over his shoulder into the warm interior of his home before turning back to her. "This isn't a charitable institution, girl. The village is 3 miles down the road. There's an inn there, they may take pity on you. But it's getting dark, and the snow is so deep," Lily pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. I don't think I can walk 3 more miles. Not my problem, the man said coldly. I didn't create your circumstances, and I'm not responsible for solving them. Good evening. And with that, he closed the door firmly in her face. Lily stood there, stunned, as the golden light vanished, and she was once again surrounded by the gathering darkness and falling snow. In all her 12 years, through all the hardships she had endured, she had never been turned away so coldly, so completely without compassion. A sob escaped her lips, turning to vapor in the frigid air. Where could she go now? The man was right. The village was too far in her current state. She would never make it before full dark. Hopelessness threatened to overwhelm her, but some stubborn spark of survival refused to be extinguished. If she couldn't go forward, perhaps there was shelter to be found elsewhere on the property. The stable, she had noticed it, would at least provide walls against the wind and snow. With legs that felt like lead, Lily made her way around the side of the grand house, following a path that had been partially cleared earlier in the day, but was now filling again with fresh snow. The stable loomed ahead, a large, well-built structure that spoke of the owner's wealth, even in his housing for animals. As she approached, a soft nickering sound came from within. Lily hesitated at the door, wondering if she would be trespassing. But the cold was becoming unbearable, and she knew that without shelter, she would not survive the night. With trembling hands, she lifted the latch and pushed the heavy wooden door just enough to slip inside. Warm air enveloped her immediately, not the cozy warmth of a fireplace, but the living warmth of large bodies and breath and hay. The stable was dim, lit only by a single lantern hanging from a beam, but after the blinding whiteness outside, it took Lily's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she gasped softly. The stable housed several horses, each in its own spacious stall, but one in particular caught her attention. In the stall nearest the door stood the most magnificent horse Lily had ever seen, a stallion with a coat as black as midnight, so sleek it seemed to shimmer even in the low light. He was tall, with powerful shoulders and an elegantly arched neck, but it was his eyes that made Lily's breath catch, large, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through her. The horse nickered softly again, stretching his neck over the half-door of his stall toward her. "Hello," Lily whispered, drawn despite her fear to those gentle eyes. "I won't hurt you. I just need somewhere to stay until morning." The horse snorted softly, as if in understanding. Lily glanced around the stable. It was clean and well kept, with fresh straw in the stalls and neatly arranged tack hanging on the walls. In one corner, she spotted a small alcove where tools were stored. There, partially hidden behind a wheelbarrow, was a pile of empty feed sacks. Careful not to disturb the horses, Lily made her way to the alcove. The feed sacks were made of rough burlap, but they were dry and could provide some insulation against the cold floor. She arranged them into a makeshift bed, her frozen fingers clumsy with the effort. Once she had created her nest, she curled up tightly, trying to conserve what little body heat remained. But it wasn't enough. Even in the relative shelter of the stable, the cold seemed to seep into her very bones. Her wet clothes only made matters worse, conducting the chill rather than protecting against it. As she lay shivering, a soft sound made her look up. The black stallion was watching her, his ears pricked forward with interest. He pawed at the ground once, then again more insistently. "What is it?" Lily whispered, her voice weak. The horse nickered softly. Then, to her amazement, he began pushing against the latch of his stall with his nose. The latch was a simple design, more to keep the stall door closed than to truly confine such an intelligent animal. After several attempts, it gave way, and the door swung open. Lily watched in astonishment as the stallion stepped out of his stall and approached her corner. She should have been frightened. He was enormous compared to her small frame, but something in his gentle demeanor calmed her fears. The horse lowered his great head, snuffling softly at her face. His breath was warm against her frozen skin. Then, to Lily's further amazement, he carefully lowered himself to the ground beside her, tucking his legs beneath him with surprising grace for such a large animal. Heat radiated from his body like a living furnace. Instinctively, Lily moved closer, drawn to the warmth. The horse did not move away, but seemed to shift slightly, creating a space against his side that was perfectly Lily-sized. With the last of her strength, she nestled against his warm flank. The horse's body heat began to thaw her frozen limbs, bringing painful pins and needles, but also blessed relief from the deadly cold. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyelids growing heavy as her body began to surrender to exhaustion. The last thing she was conscious of before sleep claimed her was the gentle rhythm of the horse's breathing and the strange sense that she was no longer alone in her struggle to survive. Inside the grand house, Alexander Blackwood sat before a roaring fire, a glass of expensive brandy in his hand, and a rare first edition open on his lap. But despite these comforts, he found himself unable to focus on the words before him. The face of the child at his door kept intruding on his thoughts. She had been desperately cold, that much was obvious. Her lips had been blue, her small frame racked with violent shivers. And yet he had sent her away without a moment's hesitation. "It's not my responsibility," he said aloud to the empty room, as if trying to convince himself. "There are proper channels for such cases. Orphanages, churches, charitable societies." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. None of those institutions was within reach of a freezing child on this snowy night. Alexander took another sip of brandy, welcoming the burn as it slid down his throat. When had he become this man? This cold, unfeeling person who could turn away a child in need? He knew the answer, though he rarely allowed himself to think of it. 10 years ago, when he had lost everything that mattered, his wife Catherine and their unborn child, both claimed by a fever that had swept through the region. The same fever that had left dozens of children, orphaned children, like the girl who had stood at his door tonight. After Catherine's death, Alexander had thrown himself into building his fortune, as if wealth could fill the gaping hole her absence had left in his life. He had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, transforming his modest inheritance into vast holdings that included this estate, farming lands, and business interests in the city. But with each passing year, he had grown colder, more isolated. He had built walls around his heart, as imposing as those around his property. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the wind howled, driving snow against the windows. How cold it must be out there now, with night fully fallen. Alexander set down his glass with a sharp click. This was ridiculous. The girl was not his concern. She had likely made it to the village by now. And if she hadn't, well, that was unfortunate, but hardly his fault. Yet the image of her small, shivering form would not leave him. With an irritated sigh, he rose from his chair and crossed to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to peer out into the darkness. The snow was falling more heavily now, thick flakes swirling in the light from the house. Visibility was poor, but he could just make out his stables in the distance. Something caught his eye. The stable door, which should have been securely latched, was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Alexander frowned. His stable master, James, was meticulously careful with the horses, especially with his prized stallion, Midnight. It was unlike him to leave the door unsecured, particularly in such weather. For a moment, Alexander considered ignoring it. James would check on the horses again before retiring for the night. But something, perhaps the same unease that had been plaguing him since turning away the child, compelled him to act. With a muttered curse, he went to the hallway and grabbed his heavy coat from the hook by the door. The blast of cold air as he stepped outside stole his breath. The comfortable warmth of his fireside seemed a distant memory as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the stables. The wind cut through his expensive coat as if it were made of paper, and he found himself wondering how the child had withstood such cold in her threadbare clothing. As he neared the stable, he noticed with growing alarm that the door was now swinging wide open. His concern for his valuable horses overshadowed any lingering thoughts of the orphan girl. If Midnight had gotten loose in this weather, it could be disastrous. Alexander pushed the door fully open and stepped inside, relief washing over him as the familiar smell of hay and horses greeted him. He reached for the lantern that hummed just inside the entrance, turning up the flame to better illuminate the interior. "Midnight?" he called, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. A soft nickering answered him, but not from where it should have been. Alexander raised the lantern higher, casting its light deeper into the stable. What he saw made him freeze in place. Midnight was not in his stall. The magnificent stallion was lying on the floor in the far corner, his black coat gleaming in the lamplight. And curled against his side, nearly hidden by his large body, was the small form of the orphan girl. Alexander approached slowly, uncertain of what he was seeing. Midnight was not a gentle horse. He was spirited and often difficult, allowing only Alexander himself and James to handle him. Yet here he was, lying peacefully beside this strange child, as if protecting her. As Alexander drew nearer, the stallion raised his head, fixing him with an intelligent gaze that seemed almost accusatory. The girl did not stir. Her face, visible in the lantern light, was pale, her lips still tinged with blue. But she was breathing, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. "Dear God," Alexander murmured, the full impact of what had happened hitting him with the force of a physical blow. His horse had somehow opened his stall and gone to the child, sharing his body heat to keep her alive, when her own master had turned her away. Shame washed over Alexander, hot and uncomfortable. What had he become? That an animal showed more compassion than he did. With careful movements, he knelt beside the pair. Up close, he could see that the girl was in even worse condition than he had realized. Her clothes were still damp from the snow, her shoes little more than tattered remnants. Her small hands, curled against Midnight's warm flank, were red and chapped, with early signs of frostbite at the fingertips. "I need to take her inside," Alexander said softly, more to himself than to the horse. But as he reached toward the child, Midnight snorted and shifted slightly, placing his body more firmly between Alexander and the girl. Alexander drew back, startled. It was as if the horse was refusing to entrust the child to him, and with good reason, given how he had treated her earlier. "I won't turn her away again," he promised, feeling slightly ridiculous for explaining himself to a horse. "She needs proper care, warmth, dry clothes, food." Midnight regarded him steadily for a long moment, as if judging his sincerity. Then, with a soft nickering sound that could almost have been a sigh, the great horse shifted again, allowing Alexander access to the sleeping child. With gentle hands, Alexander gathered her small form into his arms. She was frighteningly light, her body cold despite Midnight's efforts to warm her. She stirred slightly at being moved but did not wake, her exhaustion too profound. "Thank you," Alexander murmured to the horse, the words feeling strange on his lips. When was the last time he had thanked anyone, let alone an animal? Midnight rose to his feet in one fluid motion, shaking straw from his glossy coat. He followed as Alexander carried the girl toward the stable door, stopping at the threshold as if aware that his part in this rescue was complete. Alexander paused, looking back at the magnificent creature. "I'll come back to secure your stall once she's settled," he promised. Then he stepped out into the snowy night, holding the child close to protect her from the cold. The journey back to the house seemed much longer with his precious burden. By the time he reached the front door, Alexander's arms were aching from the effort of carrying the girl through the deep snow, but a new determination had taken hold of him. This child would not suffer any further on his account. His housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis, gasped in shock when he entered with the unconscious girl in his arms. "Mr. Blackwood, what on earth?" "This child needs immediate attention," Alexander said briskly. "She's suffering from exposure and possibly frostbite. Prepare a bath warm, not hot, and find some clothing she can wear. Then bring broth and bread to the blue guest room." Mrs. Ellis hesitated only a moment before springing into action. She was a capable woman who had managed his household efficiently for years, despite his increasingly reclusive and demanding nature. "Is she the child I saw at the door earlier?" she asked as she hurried alongside him toward the kitchen, where a large copper tub could be quickly filled. Alexander's step faltered. "You saw her? You saw her?" Mrs. Ellis's expression was carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. From the upstairs window." The unspoken judgment hung in the air between them. Mrs. Ellis had been with him since before Catherine's death. She had witnessed his transformation from a loving husband with an open heart to the cold, isolated man he had become. "Yes," Alexander admitted finally. "She is that child. I sent her away." "I see," Mrs. Ellis said, her her tone revealing nothing. "And now?" "Now I'm going to make it right," Alexander said with more confidence than he felt. While Mrs. Ellis prepared the bath, Alexander carried the girl to the kitchen, where the large cook stove kept the room pleasantly warm. He set her gently on a chair pulled close to the heat, supporting her limp form as Mrs. Ellis worked. Once the bath was ready, he discreetly withdrew, leaving Mrs. Ellis to tend to the child. He paced in the hallway outside, beset by emotions he had long thought buried: concern, compassion, and a gnawing sense of guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. After what seemed an eternity, Mrs. Ellis emerged from the kitchen. "She's awake, sir," she reported. "I've put her in a warm nightgown one of the seamstress's daughters left behind when they were measuring for curtains last month. Her fingers and toes are red and painful as they warm, but I don't believe there will be lasting damage. She's asking for the horse." "The horse?" Alexander echoed in surprise. "Yes, sir. She seems quite concerned about him. Says he saved her life." "He did," Alexander admitted quietly. "Far more than I did." Mrs. Ellis's expression softened slightly at this acknowledgement. "She should rest in a proper bed now. I've prepared the blue guest room as you requested." "Thank you. I'll carry her up." When Alexander re-entered the kitchen, he found the girl sitting wrapped in blankets before the stove. Her hair, damp from the bath, was a rich chestnut brown, instead of the dull, frozen mass it had appeared earlier. Her face, though still pale, had lost the dangerous blue tinge, and her eyes, a striking hazel with flecks of gold, were alert and wary as they sat fixed on him. "Hello," he said, suddenly uncertain how to address this child whose life he had so carelessly endangered. "I'm Alexander Blackwood. This is my home." "I know," she said softly. "You told me to go away." The simple statement, delivered without accusation but merely as a fact, struck Alexander more powerfully than any reproach could have. "Yes," he acknowledged, forcing himself to meet her steady gaze. "I did, and I was wrong to do so. I'm sorry." The girl regarded him thoughtfully, seeming older than her years in that moment. "The horse wasn't wrong," she said. "He knew I needed help." "Yes," Alexander agreed, a lump forming in his throat. "Midnight is special, more perceptive than most humans, myself included." "Is that his name? Midnight?" For the first time, a hint of animation entered her voice. "It suits him. He's beautiful." "He is," Alexander agreed, "and very valuable. But more importantly, he showed me something tonight that I had forgotten." "What's that?" the girl asked, curious despite her obvious exhaustion. "That kindness matters more than wealth or status or any of the other things I've surrounded myself with," Alexander admitted. The words felt foreign on his tongue, yet somehow right. "Now, Mrs. Ellis has prepared a room for you. You need proper rest in a real bed." The girl hesitated. Will your horse be all right? He was in the cold with me for a long time." Alexander was touched by her concern, so selfless when she herself had barely escaped death. "Midnight will be fine. I promise. I'll check on him right after I've seen you settled." This seemed to satisfy her. "My name is Lily," she offered as Alexander carefully lifted her, blankets and all. "It's nice to meet you properly, Lily," he responded, carrying her from the kitchen. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." The following morning, Alexander found himself doing something he had not done in years, eating breakfast in the kitchen instead of alone in his study. The reason for this departure from routine sat across from him at the brass, scrubbed wooden table, dwarfed by one of his own shirts that Mrs. Ellis had cleverly altered overnight to serve as a temporary dress. Lily looked remarkably recovered after a night of rest in a warm bed. There was color in her cheeks now, and her hazel eyes were bright with curiosity as she took in the grand kitchen with its gleaming copper pots and massive stove. She ate with cater, the careful manners of a child who had been taught propriety, but also with the hearty appetite of one unaccustomed to such abundance. Mrs. Ellis, normally rather stern, seemed to have taken a liking to the girl and kept encouraging her to have just a bit more of everything. "How are you feeling this morning?" Alexander asked when she had finished her second helping of porridge. "Much better, thank you, sir," Lily replied politely. "My fingers and toes still tingle a bit, But Mrs. Ellis says that's normal when they're warming up. Again. It is, Alexander confirmed. And please, call me Alexander. Sir makes me feel like an old schoolmaster. This earned him a small smile, and he was surprised by how much that simple expression warmed something long cold within him. Mrs. Ellis tells me you were meant to go to Millfield Orphanage, he continued. That's quite a distance from here. Lily nodded, her smile fading. Yes, sir, I mean, Alexander. The city orphanage closed suddenly. They said there wasn't enough money to keep it running. Most of the children were sent to other orphanages, but they had to find places for the older ones like me. Millfield was supposed to send transport, but it never came. And you decided to walk there yourself? Alexander couldn't hide the note of admiration in his voice. Such determination in one so young was remarkable. I didn't know what else to do, Lily said simply. There was no one left at the old orphanage, and I had nowhere else to go. I thought if I could just get to Millfield, they would have to take me in. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. He had heard of such situations before orphanages closing. Children displaced. It was the sort of news he had once made a point of ignoring, focusing instead on business matters and his own carefully constructed isolation. Well, he said at last, the roads are still impassable after last night's storm. Even if we could get word to Millfield, no one could travel there or come from there for several days at least. Lily's face fell slightly, though she tried to hide it. I understand. Perhaps there's somewhere in the village I could stay until then? I can work. I know how to clean and mend, and I'm learning to cook. The suggestion that this child who had nearly died on his doorstep should now be sent to work for her keep in the village struck Alexander like a physical blow. Was this what he had become? Someone who would even consider such a thing? That won't be necessary, he said quickly. You'll stay here until arrangements can be made. In fact, he hesitated, an idea forming that surprised him with its rightness. In fact, I think I may have a better solution, but I need to make some inquiries first. For now, please consider yourself my guest. Relief washed over Lily's features, quickly followed by wariness. Alexander didn't blame her for her caution. He had hardly given her reason to trust his sudden change of heart. May I see Midnight again? She asked, changing the subject. To thank him properly? Alexander smiled despite himself. Of course. As soon as you've finished breakfast. I think he would like that very much. After breakfast, Alexander escorted Lily to the stables, where they found James, the stablemaster, brushing Midnight's gleaming coat. The older man's weathered face, creased with curiosity at the sight of the small girl accompanying his normally solitary employer. But he asked no questions, merely touching his cap in brat. Greeting. James, this is Lily. Alexander introduced them. She had an adventure with Midnight last night. Did she now? James replied, his eyes twinkling with interest. Well, miss, you must be someone special. This fellow here doesn't take to just anyone. Lily approached the stall carefully, her face alight with admiration for the magnificent horse. Midnight, for his part, seemed equally interested in her, extending his head over the half-door to snuffle gently at her hair. Hello again, Lily said softly, reaching up with tentative fingers to stroke his velvet nose. Thank you for sating me. To Alexander's amazement, Midnight lowered his head further, allowing Lily to wrap her arms around his neck in a gentle hug. The normally temperamental stallion stood perfectly still, as docile as a child's pony. Well, I'll be, James murmured, standing beside Alexander. Never seen him take to anyone like that except you, sir. And even with you, he has his moods. He knew what he was doing last night, James, Alexander said quietly, watching the touching scene before him. He got out of his stall deliberately to help her. James nodded thoughtfully. Horses know things we don't sometimes, sir. My old grandmother used to say they can see into a person's heart. Alexander considered this as he watched Lily with Midnight. If that were true, what had the horse seen in him that had made him act when Alexander himself had failed to do so? And what did he see in this child that had prompted such extraordinary behavior from an animal known for his proud and often difficult temperament? As if sensing his scrutiny, Lily looked up and met Alexander's gaze. He's the most wonderful horse in the world, she declared with absolute conviction. I believe you're right, Alexander agreed, surprised to find himself smiling again. It was becoming a habit in this child's presence. Would you like to help James take care of him during your stay here? Lily's eyes widened with delight. Could I really? I've never taken care of a horse before, but I can learn quickly, I promise. I've no doubt of that, Alexander said. James is an excellent teacher. He taught me everything I know about horses when I was not much older than you. And a quick study you were, sir, James put in with a respectful nod. As I expect Miss Lily will be. For the remainder of the morning, Alexander watched as James patiently showed Lily the basics of horse care: how to approach safely, how to brush without startling, how to check hooves for stones or injuries. The girl absorbed everything with keen attention, her natural affinity for Midnight evident in the way the horse responded to her touch. As he observed them, Alexander found himself thinking of another child who would never have the chance to learn these things. The child he and Catherine had been expecting when the fever took them both. Would it have been a daughter? Perhaps with Catherine's gentle eyes and his own determined spirit? A child like Lily, brave and resilient in the face of adversity? The thought brought a familiar pain, but for the first time in years. It was not accompanied by the cold anger that had become his constant companion. Instead, he felt something different, something almost like purpose. By midday, Lily was clearly tiring. Though she tried to hide it, her ordeal had taken a toll that would require more than one night's rest to overcome. Alexander gently suggested they return to the house for lunch, promising they could visit Midnight again later. As they walked back through the snowy grounds, Lily's small hand found its way into his. The simple, trusting gesture caught Alexander off guard, causing him to miss a step. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had sought such basic human contact from him. Is something wrong? Lily asked, looking up at him with concern. No, Alexander assured her, carefully closing his fingers around hers. Nothing at all. Over lunch, served again in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, Alexander found himself drawn into conversation with Lily about her life before coming to Blackwood Manor. She spoke matter-of-factly about the city orphanage, the strict but not unkind matron, the lessons in reading, and basic arithmetic, the chores all children were expected to complete. The hardest part was when the little ones were adopted, she confided, as Mrs. Ellis served them soup and freshly baked bread. We were happy for them, of course, but it was also a reminder that no one had chosen us. Older children. Were you there long? Alexander asked, his heart heavy at the thought of this bright, brave child being passed over again and again. Since I was 3, Lily replied. I don't remember much before that. They told me my mother died in childbirth, and my father from an accident when I was small. The matter-of-fact way she delivered this information about her tragic beginnings moved Alexander deeply. How different his own response had been to loss, retreating into bitterness and isolation, rather than facing the world with the quiet courage this child displayed. After lunch, Lily began to show signs of fatigue despite her obvious desire to return to the stables. Mrs. Ellis firmly suggested a rest, and Alexander supported the recommendation, promising they would visit Midnight again before dinner. Once Lily had been settled into the blue guest room for a nap, Alexander retreated to his study. There were letters to write and arrangements to consider. The storm still raged outside, making travel impossible, but that would not last forever. Decisions would need to be made about Lily's future. The most straightforward solution would be to contact Millfield Orphanage once the roads cleared, explaining the situation and arranging for Lily to be transported there, as originally intended. It would be the proper thing to do, the expected course of action. Yet as Alexander sat at his desk, pen in hand, he found himself reluctant to begin such a letter. The image of Lily's face when she spoke of older children being passed over for adoption haunted him. She deserved better than to be shuttled from one institution to another until she was old enough to make her own way in the world. A knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he called, setting down his pen. Mrs. Ellis appeared, carrying a silver tray with his afternoon tea. Your tea, Mr. Blackwood, she said, placing it on the corner of his desk. But instead of withdrawing immediately as was her custom, she hesitated. Was there something else, Mrs. Ellis? Alexander prompted. If I may speak freely, sir, the housekeeper began, her hands clasped before her. "You may. It's about the child, sir." "Lily." Mrs. Ellis paused, choosing her words carefully. "In all my years of service here, I've never seen you as engaged as you've been since bringing her into the house." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "And your point, Mrs. Ellis?" "Simply that perhaps her presence here is beneficial, sir. Not just to her, but to you as well." The observation was delivered respectfully, but with the directness that had made Mrs. Ellis valuable to him over the years. She was one of the few people who had known him before Catherine's death, who had witnessed his gradual withdrawal from human connection. "I'm considering what's to be done about her situation," Alexander admitted. "The logical step would be to contact Millfield Orphanage once the weather clears." Mrs. Ellis nodded slowly. "That would be the logical step. Yes, sir." There was something in her tone that suggested she had more to say. "But," Alexander prompted, surprising himself with his willingness to hear her opinion, "but logic isn't always the path to happiness, sir. Neither for the child nor—" She hesitated, then added softly, "nor for yourself." Alexander leaned back in his chair, regarding his housekeeper thoughtfully. In 10 years, this was perhaps the most personal conversation they had shared. "Are you suggesting I keep her here, Mrs. Ellis? A bachelor with no experience raising children, living in an isolated country manor? What kind of life would that be for a young girl?" "A better one than at Millfield, I'd wager," Mrs. Ellis said frankly. "I've heard stories about that place, sir. Overcrowded, underfunded. The children receive basic care. Nothing more. No affection, no individual attention." She paused before adding, "And no horses that come to their rescue in the night." This last comment brought an unexpected smile to Alexander's lips. "Midnight does seem rather taken with her." "As is she with him," Mrs. Ellis agreed. "And if I may be so bold, sir, horses are excellent judges of character." "So James's grandmother believed," Alexander murmured, recalling their earlier conversation. "Mrs. Ellis, are you implying that I should— what? Adopt the child?" The idea, spoken aloud, seemed simultaneously absurd and entirely right. Alexander himself couldn't tell if he was mocking the suggestion or genuinely considering it. "I'm not presuming to tell you what to do, sir," Mrs. Ellis replied diplomatically. "I'm merely observing that in the short time she's been here, this house has felt more like a home than it has in many years." With that, she curtsied slightly and withdrew, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts and her pointed observations. The truth of her words was uncomfortable, yet undeniable. In less than a day, Lily's presence had begun to thaw something long frozen within him. The simple act of sharing meals at the kitchen table, of walking hand in hand through the snow, of watching her gentle interaction with Midnight, all had awakened feelings he had believed buried forever with Catherine. But was that enough reason to consider something as momentous as adoption? He was not prepared for fatherhood. His life was ordered, solitary, focused on business matters and the management of his estate. A child would disrupt everything. And yet, even as these objections formed in his mind, Alexander found himself mentally rearranging his life to accommodate Lily's presence. The unused nursery could be redecorated as a bedroom, suitable for a girl her age. A governess could be hired for her education. The village had several girls near her age who could become friends. And of course, there was Midnight, who had formed such an immediate and extraordinary bond with her. Alexander poured himself a cup of tea, noting absently that Mrs. Ellis had included an extra biscuit on the tray, a small luxury he rarely allowed himself, but that seemed somehow appropriate today. As he sipped the hot liquid, he found his gaze drawn to the window, where the snow continued to fall. Somewhere out there was a village full of people who had rarely seen him in the decades since Catherine's death. They knew him only as the wealthy, reclusive owner of Blackwood Manor, a man who employed many but befriended none. What would they make of Alexander Blackwood, adoptive father? The thought was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his musings. "Enter," he called, expecting Mrs. Ellis returning for the tea tray. Instead, Lily stood in the doorway, her hair slightly mussed from her nap, her too large borrowed clothes making her appear even smaller than she was. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said hesitantly. "Mrs. Ellis said you were working." Not at all, Alexander assured her, setting down his cup. Come in. Did you rest well? Lily nodded, stepping into the study with obvious curiosity. Her gaze traveled over the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the large desk with its neat stacks of papers, the comfortable leather armchairs before the fire. Your study is almost as big as the entire classroom at the orphanage, she observed. This simple statement, delivered without envy or accusation, merely as a fact, reminded Alexander sharply of the disparity between his privileged existence and the life Lily had known. Do you like to read? He asked, noticing her interest in the bookshelves. Oh yes, she said, her face lighting up. Reading was my favorite part of school. The matron sometimes let me borrow books from her personal collection when I finished my lessons early. What sort of books do you enjoy? Adventures, mostly, Lily admitted. Stories about people who travel to far-off places and have amazing experiences. And I like books about animals, too. Alexander smiled, remembering his own childhood reading preferences. I believe I have some books you might enjoy. Would you like to borrow one during your stay here? Lily's eyes widened with delight. Could I really? I'd be very careful with it, I promise. I know you would, Alexander said, rising from his desk and crossing to a section of shelving near the fireplace. In fact, these books have been waiting for someone exactly like you to read them. The words were out before he fully considered their implication that these books, purchased years ago with his future child in mind, had indeed been waiting for this particular child. The realization sent a strange shiver through him, not unpleasant, but unsettling in its rightness. From the shelf, he selected a handsomely bound volume. This was a favorite of mine when I was young, he said, handing it to Lily. It's about a wild horse and the boy who befriends him. Lily received the book reverently, running her fingers over the embossed cover. Thank you, she said, her voice soft with genuine gratitude for what must seem to her a princely gift. I'll treasure it. You're welcome to read it here by the fire, Alexander offered, gesturing to one of the armchairs. It's comfortable, and the light is good. Lily hesitated. Are you sure I won't disturb your work? I find I'm not particularly focused on work today, Alexander admitted. In fact, I was just thinking about taking a walk to the stables to check on Midnight. Would you care to join me after you've had a chance to look at your book? Yes, please. Lily's enthusiasm brought another smile to Alexander's face. How many times had he smiled today? More than in the past year combined, he suspected. As Lily settled into one of the large armchairs, her small form nearly swallowed by its dimensions, Alexander returned to his desk. He still had letters to write, but the one to Millfield Orphanage no longer seemed so urgent. Instead, he began a different letter, one to his solicitor in the city, inquiring about the legal requirements for adoption. It was a preliminary inquiry only, he told himself. No decisions had been made. But even as he wrote, Alexander knew in his heart that some decision had indeed been made, not in his mind, but in a place deeper and more truthful. By the time they visited the stables later that afternoon, the snow had finally stopped falling, though the accumulation was substantial. The world outside was transformed into a glittering white landscape, pristine and peaceful under a clearing sky. Midnight greeted them both with obvious pleasure, particularly Lily, whom he seemed to recognize as his special charge. Under James's watchful but approving eye, Lily helped with the evening feeding and grooming, her natural affinity with the horse growing more apparent with each interaction. He's never been so gentle, James remarked to Alexander as they watched Lily carefully brushing Midnight's glossy coat. It's like he knows she needs special handling. I believe he does know, Alexander replied thoughtfully. Better than I did, to my shame. James glanced at his employer, surprise evident on his weathered face. It was unlike Alexander Blackwood to admit to any shortcoming. If you don't mind my saying so, sir, sometimes it takes a shock to open our eyes to what's important. Alexander nodded slowly. Indeed, James. And sometimes that shock comes in the form of a horse breaking out of his stall to shame his master into basic human decency. The stable master chuckled. Midnight always was too clever by half. But I think there's more to it than that. He saw something special in the girl, same as the rest of us are seeing now. This casual comment, the inclusion of Lily as someone the rest of us were concerned with, struck Alexander forcefully. In less than a day, the child had been accepted as part of the household, her presence already seeming natural and right. That evening, dinner was served in the formal dining room rather than the kitchen, but with significant departures from Alexander's usual solitary meal. Lily was seated to his right, her chair raised with cushions to a comfortable height. Mrs. Ellis had outdone herself with the menu, preparing dishes she thought might appeal to a child while still meeting her employer's standards. Lily's manners were impressive for a child raised in an orphanage. She handled the array of silverware with only minor hesitation and waited for Alexander to begin before starting her own meal. The matron was very strict about table manners, she explained when he commented on her poise. She said proper behavior was the most valuable thing she could teach us, since we had no family advantages. Again, the matter-of-fact way she referred to her circumstances touched Alexander deeply. There was no self-pity in her tone, just an acceptance of reality that seemed far beyond her years. As they ate, Alexander found himself sharing stories of Midnight's early days at Blackwood Manor, how the spirited colt had initially resisted training, how he had gradually gained the horse's trust through patience and consistency. He needed someone who wouldn't give up on him, Alexander concluded. Many would have sold him as too difficult, but I saw something special in him worth persevering for. I'm glad you didn't give up, Lily said earnestly. He's the most wonderful horse in the world. He proved that beyond doubt last night, Alexander agreed. After dinner, they retired to the library, where a fire blazed warmly in the grate. It was another departure from routine for Alexander, who typically spent his evenings alone in his study with account books or correspondence. But tonight, he found himself reading aloud from the book he had given Lily, surprised by how much he enjoyed the simple pleasure of sharing a story. When Lily began to nod sleepily despite her evident interest in the tale, Alexander marked their place and closed the book. I think that's enough for tonight, he said gently. We can continue tomorrow. The casual promise of tomorrow hung in the air between them, as Mrs. Ellis appeared to escort Lily up to bed. The child hesitated, then impulsively stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Alexander's waist in a brief hug. Thank you for the story, she said, pulling back quickly, as if uncertain her gesture would be welcomed. And for letting me help with Midnight. Touched beyond words, Alexander could only nod. Good night, Lily, he managed finally. Sleep well. After she had gone, he remained by the fire, staring into the flames as he pondered the extraordinary turn his life had taken in less than 24 hours. The solitude he had so carefully cultivated for a decade now seemed not peaceful but empty. The routine he had established felt not orderly but sterile. And the future he had envisioned more of the same isolation stretching endlessly before him, now appeared unbearably bleak compared to the possibility that had presented itself in the form of one small, brave girl. Morning brought clear skies and brilliant sunshine that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling spectacle. Alexander woke earlier than usual, his mind already active with plans and possibilities. After dressing, he went immediately to check on Lily, only to find the blue guest room empty, the bed neatly made. A momentary panic seized him before he heard the sound of laughter coming from downstairs, Lily's high, clear voice, and Mrs. Ellis's deeper tones. Following the sound to the kitchen, he found them working together at the large table, Lily stirring a bowl of batter, while Mrs. Ellis prepared a griddle on the stove. Good morning, he said from the doorway, struck by the domestic scene before him. Both turned, Willie's face lighting up at the sight of him. Good morning. Mrs. Ellis is teaching me to make pancakes. She says they're your favorite. They are indeed, Alexander confirmed, stepping into the warmth of the kitchen. Though, I rarely indulge in them these days. Today seemed like a special occasion, sir, Mrs. Ellis said with a meaningful glance at Lily. And Miss Lily here is proving to be quite adept in the kitchen. I like cooking, Lily explained, returning her attention to the batter. At the orphanage, the older children helped in the kitchen on weekends. Alexander took a seat at the table, content to watch the proceedings. There was something deeply satisfying about this simple morning scene, something he had not experienced since Catherine's death. It was the feeling of being part of a family. After a breakfast of perfect golden pancakes drizzled with maple syrup, another luxury Alexander rarely allowed himself, but thoroughly enjoyed this morning. He and Lily bundled up to visit the stables. The snow was deep but sparkling in the sunshine, and Alexander found himself drawn into an impromptu snowball fight when Lily impulsively threw a perfectly formed missile that caught him squarely in the chest. His shocked expression must have worried her, for she immediately began to apologize. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Her words were cut off by a snowball that sailed past her ear, missing by inches. Alexander stood with another already formed in his gloved hands, a challenge in his eyes. "Your aim needs work," he said with mock seriousness. "Allow me to demonstrate." What followed was Blackwood Manor's first snowball battle in over a decade. By the time they reached the stables, both were breathless with exertion and laughter, their coats covered with snow. James greeted them with raised eyebrows and a poorly concealed smile. "Looks like you two took the scenic route," he observed, brushing snow from Alexander's shoulder with casual familiarity that would have been unthinkable a day earlier. In the bright morning light, the stables took on a different character from the shadowy haven of Lily's first night. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the clean straw and gleaming tack. Midnight stood at attention in his stall, his intelligent eyes following Lily's every movement. "He's been watching the door all morning," James informed them. "Knew you were coming, I expect." Lily went to the horse immediately, her face glowing with delight as Midnight lowered his head to greet her. "Good morning, handsome boy," she said, stroking his velvet nose. "Did you sleep well?" "I did, thanks to you." The bond between child and horse was extraordinary to witness. Midnight, who typically tolerated attention rather than seeking it, seemed to actively enjoy Lily's ministrations as she brushed his coat until it gleamed like polished obsidian. Throughout the morning, Alexander observed their interaction, marveling at the natural way Lily communicated with the spirited animal. It was as if some unspoken understanding existed between them, a connection forged in that critical night when each had needed the other. As midday approached, Alexander reluctantly acknowledged that it was time to address practical matters. The roads would soon be cleared enough for travel, and decisions needed to be made. He had spent much of the night considering his options, weighing his growing attachment to Lily against the practical challenges of becoming a guardian to a child at this stage in his life. "Lily," he said as they walked back toward the house for lunch, "there's something I'd like to discuss with you." She looked up at him, her expression open and trusting in a way that tightened his chest with emotion. "Yes, Alexander? You know that once the roads are cleared, we'll need to make arrangements for your future," he began carefully. Lily's face fell slightly, though she tried to hide her disappointment. "I know. You'll need to contact Millfield Orphanage. That was my initial thought," Alexander acknowledged. "But I've been considering an alternative possibility." They had reached a decorative stone bench near the garden, now covered with a thick blanket of snow. Alexander brushed a space clear and gestured for Lily to sit beside him. The sunshine was warm, despite the cold air, making the spot surprisingly comfortable. "What kind of alternative?" Lily asked, curiosity warring with what looked like carefully suppressed hope in her expressive eyes. Alexander took a deep breath. "I've been thinking that perhaps, if you were agreeable, you might consider staying here, permanently, as my ward." Lily's eyes widened. "You mean live here, at Blackwood Manor, with you and Mrs. Ellis and James and Midnight?" "Yes," Alexander confirmed, his heart racing with an anxiety he hadn't experienced in years. "I would become your legal guardian. You would have a home here, an education, everything you need." He hesitated, then added the most important part, "and you would never have to worry about being sent away again." For a long moment, Lily was silent, her young face serious as she processed this unexpected offer. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you want to keep me?" The directness of the question caught Alexander off guard. He had prepared logical arguments about mutual benefit and practicality, but faced with Lily's simple inquiry, he found himself answering from a place of truth he had long avoided. "Because in the short time you've been here, you've reminded me of what it means to truly live, not just exist," he said quietly. "Because you have courage and kindness that humble me. Because Midnight chose you, and he's a far better judge of character than I've proven to be." He paused, then added, "And because I think we could be good for each other." Lily's eyes filled with tears that glittered in the sunlight. "Do you really mean it?" she whispered. "You won't change your mind later?" Alexander felt a lump form in his throat at the vulnerability in her question, the fear of once again being abandoned by someone who had offered hope. "I promise," he said solemnly. "If you choose to stay, this will be your home for as long as you wish it to be." Without warning, Lily launched herself into his arms, nearly knocking him off the bench with the force of her embrace. "Yes," she cried, her voice muffled against his coat. "Yes, I want to stay." Alexander held her close, this small, brave child who had somehow breached walls he had spent a decade building. Over her head, his gaze traveled to the stables, where Midnight stood watching from his paddock, as if approving the scene before him. Then it settled, Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome home, Willie." The news spread quickly through the household. Mrs. Ellis received it with a satisfied nod that suggested she had expected nothing less. James beamed openly, and immediately began making plans for teaching Lily to ride properly once the weather improved. By late afternoon, the household was humming with activity and purpose it hadn't known in years. Mrs. Ellis was inventorying linens for the bedroom that would become Lily's permanent chamber. James had brought in evergreen boughs to decorate the main rooms, giving the house a festive air it had lacked through many lonely holiday seasons. Alexander himself spent several hours writing letters first to his solicitor, with firm instructions about the adoption process, then to a respected academy for young ladies in the nearby town, inquiring about a governess who might provide daily lessons until Lily was ready to attend school proper. As he sealed the last envelope, he became aware of Lily standing in the doorway of his study, watching him with a mixture of happiness and lingering disbelief. "Is everything all right?" he asked, beckoning her in. She came to stand beside his desk, her fingers trailing reverently over the polished wood. "I was just thinking about how different everything is from yesterday," she said thoughtfully. "Yesterday morning, I was lost in the snow with nowhere to go. And now you have a home," Alexander finished for her. "Though I think we both know who deserves the credit for that." He glanced meaningfully toward the stables. Lily smiled. "Midnight. He knew what he was doing, didn't he, when he came to find me?" "I believe he did," Alexander agreed. "Horses are wiser than humans in many ways. Midnight saw what I couldn't or wouldn't see. That people need each other?" Lily suggested. Alexander nodded, struck again by the perceptiveness of this remarkable child. "Exactly that. I forgot that truth for a long time after I lost someone I loved very much." "Your wife?" Lily asked gently. "Yes, Catherine. She died 10 years ago, along with our unborn child." "I'm sorry," Lily said, her empathy evident in her face. "That must have been very sad." "It was," Alexander acknowledged. "So sad that I decided it was easier not to care about anyone or anything except business matters and material concerns." He shook his head ruefully. "Not my wisest decision." "But you care about Midnight," Lily pointed out. "Yes. He was the one exception I allowed myself. Perhaps because he asked so little of me emotionally while giving so much in return." Lily considered this thoughtfully. "And now? Do you think you can care about people again?" The question, so innocent, yet so profound, pierced Alexander to his core. "I'm learning to," he admitted. "Thanks to a very special horse and an even more special young lady." Lily's smile illuminated her entire face. "I think Mrs. Ellis said lunch is nearly ready. She's making soup and fresh bread." "Is she? Then we shouldn't keep her waiting." Alexander rose from his desk, offering his hand to Lily. As her small fingers curled trustingly around his, he felt a sense of rightness that had been absent from his life for far too long. 3 days later, the roads were finally clear enough for travel. Word had begun to spread through the village about the orphan girl Alexander Blackwood had taken in a development that caused quite a stir among locals who had long viewed the master of Blackwood Manor as cold and unapproachable. The first visitor was the village doctor, ostensibly arriving to check on Lily's health after her ordeal in the snow, but clearly curious about the changes rumored to have taken place at the manor. He departed visibly impressed both by Lily's resilience and by the transformed demeanor of her guardian. Next came the vicar, bearing belated Christmas gifts for the child and cautious good wishes for Alexander. His initial wariness gave way to genuine pleasure as he witnessed the natural rapport between the unlikely pair. By the end of the week, several families from the village had called, bringing small welcome presents for Lily and invitations for her to meet their own children once she was fully settled. Alexander received them all with a graciousness that surprised even himself, opening doors that had been closed for a decade. Through it all, Midnight remained a central figure in the unfolding story. Villagers who came to call invariably asked to see the remarkable horse who had saved the orphan girl. The stable yard became a place of pilgrimage, with Midnight receiving visitors with a regal dignity that befitted his newfound status. James, delighted by the attention his favorite charge was receiving, took to telling the story with increasing embellishment. By the second week, according to his version, Midnight had not only broken out of his stall, but had galloped miles through the blizzard to find Lily, somehow sensing her presence with almost supernatural perception. Alexander let these exaggerations pass without correction. The truth was extraordinary enough. A horse had shown more compassion than his master, and in doing so, had changed not just one life, but many. The most significant visitor arrived 10 days after Lily's rescue. Alexander's solicitor, Mr. Harrington, came personally from the city, bearing the legal documents required for adoption. A precise, practical man, he had known Alexander for many years and had observed his gradual withdrawal from society with professional concern but personal restraint. Now, seated in Alexander's study with the adoption papers spread before them, he made no attempt to hide his approval of the changes he observed. "I must say, Blackwood, this is the best decision you've made in a decade," he said frankly as he indicated where signatures were required. "The child has brought life back to this house. Anyone can see it." "Not a decision I made," Alexander replied, signing his name with a flourish. "Rather, one that was made for me by a horse with more wisdom than his owner." Harrington chuckled. "Yes, I've heard the story. Remarkable animal." "He is that," Alexander agreed. "But Lily is the truly remarkable one. Her courage, her resilience, they humble me daily." The solicitor nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes what we need most comes to us in unexpected packages. I remember telling you something similar after Catherine's passing, though you weren't ready to hear it then." Alexander acknowledged this truth with a rueful nod. "I wasn't ready for much of anything then, except building walls between myself and the world." He glanced toward the window, where Lily could be seen in the garden, building a snow sculpture with the daughter of the village baker. "I'm grateful it's not too late to learn a better way." Once the legal formalities were complete, Alexander arranged a small celebration to officially welcome Lily to Blackwood Manor as his ward. The village turned out in force, curious to witness the transformation of both the reclusive landowner and his property. The manor, so long closed to visitors, was opened wide. Fires blazed in every hearth, greenery adorned the walls, and tables groaned under the weight of food and drink provided by Mrs. Ellis and her hastily recruited helpers from the village. At the center of it all was Lily, dressed in a new blue frock that matched her eyes, her hair arranged in careful curls by Mrs. Ellis. She moved among the guests with natural grace, accepting their good wishes with a poise that belied her years. And beside her, more often than not, stood Alexander, his face softened by a happiness few in the village could remember seeing there. The change in him was so marked that several older residents commented that he looked more like the young man who had brought Catherine home as a bride than the bitter recluse he had become after her death. As the afternoon progressed, Alexander noticed Lily slipping away from the festivities. Following discreetly, he found her in the stables, where Midnight stood waiting as if expecting her visit. "Too many people?" Alexander asked gently, joining her beside the stall. Lily nodded, her hand resting on Midnight's velvet nose. "A little. I'm not used to being the center of attention." She glanced up at Alexander. "Did you mind me leaving?" "Not at all," he assured her. "In fact, I was feeling a bit overwhelmed myself. It's been a long time since Blackwood Manor has seen such a gathering. Mrs. Ellis said there haven't been parties here since. Lily hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to continue. Since Catherine died, Alexander finished for her. It's all right to speak of her, Lily. She would have liked you very much, I think. Would she? Lily asked, her face brightening at the thought. Very much indeed. She had a special way with creatures, not unlike your gift with Midnight here. And she believed strongly in second chances. Alexander reached out to stroke the horse's gleaming neck, something this fellow seems to believe in as well. Midnight nickered softly, as if agreeing with this assessment. The intelligent eyes that had once judged Alexander wanting now regarded him with what could only be described as approval. He gave us both a second chance. Didn't he? Lily said thoughtfully. Me at having a family, and you at that remembering how to be human, Alexander finished when she trailed off. Yes, precisely that. They stood in companionable silence, the man and the girl and the horse who had brought them together. Outside, the celebration continued, but here in the quiet of the stable, a different kind of celebration was taking place. One marked not by noise and festivity, but by the deep contentment of coming home. As winter gave way to spring, life at Blackwood Manor settled into new and pleasant rhythms. Lily began formal lessons with Miss Gardner, a young governess from the academy in town who came daily to instruct her in reading, writing, mathematics, and the social graces required of a young lady in her position. To everyone's delight, Lily proved an excellent student, her natural intelligence sharpened by her determination to make her guardian proud. Alexander often found himself helping with her lessons in the evenings, rediscovering his own love of learning through her enthusiastic questions. But the most important lessons continued to take place in the stables. True to his word, James began teaching Lily to ride as soon as the snow melted, to no one's surprise. Midnight, who had previously tolerated no rider except Alexander, accepted Lily on his back without protest. The sight of the small girl perched confidently atop the magnificent black stallion soon became a familiar one around Blackwood Manor. James started them in the paddock, but as Lily's skills developed, they progressed to the meadows and gentle trails that wound through the estate. Alexander often accompanied them on these rides, mounted on his second-best horse, a reliable bay gelding. He took quiet pride in watching Ran. Lily's growing mastery, her natural affinity with Midnight blossoming into a partnership that experienced riders twice her age might envy. One golden afternoon in late May, they rode to the top of a gentle hill that offered a panoramic view of the manor and its surrounding lands. The estate looked particularly beautiful from this vantage point, the house with its gray stone and slate roof, the stables and outbuildings, the gardens now vibrant with spring blooms, and beyond them the patchwork of fields and woodlands that comprised the larger property. It's like a painting, Lily observed, her face flushed with the pleasure of the ride and the view. It is rather spectacular, Alexander agreed, though I confess I hadn't properly looked at it in years before you came. Lily glanced at him curiously. What do you mean? Alexander considered how to explain. I was so caught up in managing the estate as a business that I stopped seeing its beauty, he said finally. I knew its value but had forgotten its worth, if that makes sense. I think so, Lily said thoughtfully. Like knowing how much money something costs, but not remembering why you wanted it in the first place? Exactly that, Alexander said, impressed once again by her perceptiveness. You have a way of getting to the heart of matters, Lily. She smiled, pleased by the compliment. Miss Gardner says I'm too direct sometimes. That a proper young lady should be more circumspect, I think was the word. Alexander chuckled. Miss Gardner isn't wrong about the conventions of society, but between us, I prefer your directness. It's refreshing after years of people being overly careful around me. Because you were grumpy? Lily asked innocently. Because I was grumpy, Alexander confirmed with a laugh. Exceedingly grumpy, I'm afraid. You're not grumpy now, Lily observed, patting Midnight's neck as the horse shifted beneath her. At least, not usually. No, not usually, Alexander agreed. I find it difficult to maintain a proper level of grumpiness in your company, yours and this fellow's. He nodded toward Midnight, who tossed his head as if acknowledging the reference. They fell silent for a moment, enjoying the panoramic view and the perfect spring day. Then Lily spoke again, her voice more hesitant than Ban. Usual. Alexander? May I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret taking me in? I mean, your life was very different before. Quieter. More orderly. The question caught Alexander by surprise, not because he had never considered it, but because the answer seemed so self-evident, he hadn't thought it needed stating. Lily, he said, turning in his saddle to face her directly, taking you in, or rather, being shamed into doing so by this noble beast, was the best thing that has happened to me in a decade. My life before was not quieter. It was empty. Not orderly, but meaningless. He reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. I could never, ever regret the day you came into my life.